and welcome to, first of all, me turning off, not turning off, closing my blinds. Firstly, we close the blinds. We have to go the other way, otherwise the sun comes in and we're going to get a weird angle. Okay, let's do this. All right, welcome to not only the last live stream of Northanger Abbey, but my last daily live stream of books on YouTube Live. I may be coming back to do weekly. I hope so, but we'll see. I still haven't sent out the email that I said I would send out. That's what happens. So yeah, it's been a wonderful time to do these with you. I'm really excited to see what the end of this is. And it's just it's a little bittersweet, but I think the right time. I think it's the right time to go because school's starting to kick up and I'm doing a lot this quarter. And we'll just wait and see. But we may be coming back on a weekly basis versus a daily basis. So, but we'll just have to wait and see. So watch your inbox for when I eventually send that email. Eventually. Someday. Okay, let's do this. So what happened yesterday in Northanger Abbey? Not a lot. Yesterday, Catherine arrives home and is just kind of bummed. And she goes around and talks to her parents and they're like, okay, that's weird, but clearly he's just not a great guy, Mr. Papa Tilney. He's just not a great guy. He's got some weird thing going on. Don't think too much about it. You're okay. We love you. Just chill out. Have some fun here with us. We've missed you. It's good for you to be home. And Catherine's like, yeah, it's good to be home. It's kind of weird, but okay. Hey! But yeah, I'm glad you're here to play us out, everybody. But yeah, so that's what happened yesterday. Just nobody really knows what's going on. It's just kind of weird. And that's where we're at, is that Catherine's okay emotionally, but I almost fell off my chair. It's going to happen on live one day. Not on live, but in my Zoom class. I'm going to just fall off my chair. I'm the unintentional class clown because I show everything on when I'm concerned on my face. And so the professors are always like, you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm just going through it. So let's do this. Again, I've never not known what the end of a book is going to be like. And now I do. No, I don't. I don't know. But now I don't know, That's what I meant to say. So, for one final time, let's do Northanger Abbey. Isn't that crazy? That smells really good, whatever that is. Beautiful. Okay. Here we go. It's not the last chapter. Second to last chapter. It's going to be a long one today. Northanger Abbey, Volume 1, Chapter 15, Volume 2. Volume 2. Catherine's disposition was not naturally sedentary, nor had her habits been ever very industrious, but whatever might hitherto have been her defects of that sort, her mother could not but perceive them now to be greatly increased. She could neither sit still nor employ herself for 10 minutes together, walking round the garden and orchard again and again, as if nothing but motion was voluntary. And it seemed as if she could even walk about the house rather than remain fixed for any time in the parlor. Her loss of spirits was a yet greater alteration. In her rambling and her idleness she might only be a caricature of herself, but in her silence and sadness she was the very reverse of all that she had been before. For 2 days Mrs. Moreland allowed it to pass even without a hint, but when a third night's rest had neither restored her cheerfulness, improved her in the useful activity, nor given her a greater inclination for needlework, she could no longer refrain from the gentle reproof of, "My dear Catherine, I am afraid you are growing quite a fine lady. I do not know when poor Richard's cravats would be done, if he had no friend but you. Your head runs too much upon Bath, but there is a time for everything. A time for balls and plays, and a time for work. You have had a long run of amusement, and now you must try to be useful." Catherine took up her work directly, saying in a dejected voice that her head did not run upon Bath much. Then you are fretting about General Tilney, and that is very simple of you, for 10 to 1 whether you ever see him again. You should never fret about trifles. That's worse. That's worse. After a short silence, I hope, my Catherine, you are not getting out of humor with home, because it is not so grand as Northanger. That would be turning your visit into an evil indeed. Wherever you are, you should always be contented, but especially at home, because there you must spend the most of your time. I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much about the French bread at Northanger. Come on, man. Like, she's depressed. Give her a minute. Like, women are allowed to have emotions other than, like, sunshine. My only emotion is sunshine, because I am a woman. I'm sure I do not care about the bread. It is all the same to me what I eat. There was a very clever essay in one of the books upstairs upon much such a subject, about young girls that have been spoiled for home by great acquaintance. The Mirror, I think. I will look it out for you some day or other, because I am sure it will do you good. This is so mean. Like, I don't like it. Catherine said no more, and with an endeavor to do right, applied to her work, but after a few minutes sunk again, without knowing it herself, into languor and listlessness, moving herself in her chair from the irritation of weariness much oftener than she moved her needle. Mrs. Moreland watched the progress of the relapse, and seeing in her daughter's absent and dissatisfied look the full proof of that repining spirit to which she had now begun to attribute her want of cheerfulness, hastily left the room to fetch the book in question, anxious to lose no time in attacking so dreadful a malady. It was some time before she could find what she looked for, and other family matters occurred to detain her. A quarter of an hour had elapsed ere she returned downstairs with the volume from which so much was hoped. Her evocations above having shut out all noise but what she created herself. She knew not that a visitor had arrived within the last few minutes till, on entering the room, the first object she beheld was a young man whom she had never seen before. With a look of much respect, he immediately rose, and being introduced to her by her conscious... Oh, this is the mom. By her conscious daughter as Mr. Henry Tilney, with the embarrassment of real sensibility, began to apologize for his appearance there, acknowledging that after what had passed he had little right to expect a welcome at Fullerton, and stating his impatience to be assured of Miss Moreland's having reached her home in safety, as the cause of his intrusion. Where was I? I got so excited I lost my place. There we go. He did not address himself to an uncandid judge or a resentful heart. Far from comprehending him or his sister in their father's misconduct, Mrs. Moreland had been always kindly disposed towards each, and instantly pleased by his appearance, received him with the simple professions of unaffected benevolence, thanking him for such an attention to her daughter, assuring him that the friends of her children were always welcome there, and entreating him to say not another word of the past. Well, I kind of feel like maybe I would like some more words of the past, for example, an explanation. He was not ill-inclined to obey this request, for though his heart was greatly relieved by such unlooked-for mildness, it was not just at that moment in his power to say anything to the purpose. Returning in silence to his seat, therefore, he remained for some minutes most civilly answering all Mrs. Moreland's common remarks about the weather and roads. Catherine, meanwhile, the anxious, agitated, happy, feverish Catherine, said not a word, but her glowing cheek and brightened eye made her mother trust that this good-natured visit would at least set her heart at ease for a time, and gladly, therefore, did she lay aside the first volume of the Mirror for a future hour. Desirous of Mr. Moreland's assistance, as well in giving encouragement as in finding the conversation for her guest, whose embarrassment on his father's account she earnestly pitied, Mrs. Moreland had very early dispatched one of the children to summon him. But Mr. Moreland was from home, and being thus without any support, at the end of a quarter of an hour, she had nothing to say. After a couple of minutes' unbroken silence, Henry, turning to Catherine for the first time since her mother's entrance, asked her, with sudden alacrity, if Mr. and Mrs. Allen were now at Fullerton. And on developing, from amidst all her perplexity of words in reply, the meaning which one short syllable would have given, immediately expressed his intention of paying his respects to them, and with a rising color asked her if she would have the goodness to show him the way. He's like, we want to go see the Allens together? Oh God. You may see the house from this window, sir, was information on Sarah's side, which produced only a bow of acknowledgement from the gentleman, and a silencing nod from her mother. For Mrs. Moreland, thinking it probable as a secondary consideration in his wish of waiting on their worthy neighbours, that he might have some explanation to give of his father's behaviour, which it must be more pleasant for him to communicate only to Catherine, would not on any account prevent her accompanying him. They began their walk, and Mrs. Moreland was not entirely mistaken in his object in wishing it. Some explanation on his father's account he had to give, but his first purpose was to explain himself, and before they reached Mr. Allen's grounds, he had done it so well that Catherine did not think it could ever be repeated too often. She was assured of his affection, that heart in return was solicited, which perhaps they pretty equally knew already was entire. What? Oh my God, I don't understand anything, and not only do I not understand, I cannot read it. Let's try this again. She was assured of his affection, and that heart in return was solicited. They got crushes on each other. Great. Which perhaps they pretty equally knew was already entirely his own. So they both knew that she had a crush on him. For though Henry was now sincerely attached to her, though he felt and delighted in all the excellencies of her character and truly loved her society, I must confess that his affection originated in nothing better than gratitude, or, in other words, that a persuasion of her partiality for him had been the only cause of giving her serious thought. Okay, so the only reason he was like, I think she's into me. She's kind of cute, so I'm going to go for it. That's what just happened, right? I think that's what happened. And now he's like fully into her. But the original attraction was simply that she was into him. My worst fear. Not really. Anyways. I just don't want people to ever know that I like them, you know? I want that to be a secret until the very end. Until we're on the altar and we're like, wait, you like me? How long have you liked me? That's the way we want to go with it. Okay, where was I? It is a new circumstance in romance, I acknowledge, and dreadfully derogatory of a heroine's dignity, but if it be as new in common life, the credit of a wild imagination will at least be all my own. A very short visit to Mrs. Allen, in which Henry talked at random, without sense or connection, and Catherine, wrapped in the contemplation of her own unutterable happiness, scarcely opened her lips, dismissed them to the ecstasies of another tete-a-tete. I hate that one because I never feel like I do it right. And before it was suffered to close, she was enabled to judge how far he was sanctioned by parental authority in his present application. On his return from Woodston 2 days before, here we go. He had been met near the Abbey by his impatient father, hastily informed in angry terms of Miss Moreland's departure, and ordered to think of her no more. Such was the permission upon which he had now offered her his hand. You didn't think to, like, clarify? You were just like, my dad's really mad at her, so I should probably go propose. Should I clarify? Nah. The affrighted Catherine, amidst all the terrors of expectation as she listened to this account, could not but rejoice in the kind caution with which Henry had saved her from the necessity of a conscientious rejection, by engaging her faith before he mentioned the subject. And as he proceeded to give the particulars and explain the motives of his father's conduct, her feelings soon hardened into even a triumphant delight. The general had had nothing to accuse her of, nothing to lay to her charge, but her being the involuntary, unconscious object of a deception which his pride could not pardon, and which a better pride would have been ashamed to own. She was guilty only of being less rich than he had supposed her to be. What kind of asshole? What kind of world? That's it. Wow. General Tilney really is the scum of the earth. Under a mistaken persuasion of her possessions and claims, he had courted her acquaintance in Bath, solicited her company at Northanger. Oh my God. And designed her for his daughter-in-law. On discovering his error, to turn her from the house seemed best, though to his feelings an inadequate proof of his resentment towards herself and his contempt of her family. So General Tilney was a gold digger, but like reverse. That's incredibly messed up. Wuthering Heights has nothing on this man. That's not true. Wuthering Heights is pretty bad. Ezra, hello. Where were we? Oh my gosh. John Thorpe had first misled him. I knew it had to come back to that knucklehead. The general, perceiving his son one night at the theatre to be paying considerable attention to Miss Moreland, had accidentally inquired of Thorpe if he knew more of her than her name. Oh, John Thorpe. Oh, little Thorpey boy. Can I call him John Twerp? Hello. Where was I? Lost it. Okay. Thorpe, most happy to be on speaking terms with a man of General Tilney's importance, had been joyfully and proudly communicative, and being at the time not only in daily expectation of Moreland's engaging Isabella, but likewise pretty well resolved upon marrying Catherine himself, his vanity induced him to represent the family as yet more wealthy than his vanity and avarice had made him believe them. With whomsoever he was, or was likely to be connected, his own consequence always required that theirs should be great, and as his intimacy with any acquaintance grew, so regularly grew their fortune. The expectations of his friend Moreland, therefore, from the first overrated, had ever since his introduction to Isabella been gradually increasing, and by merely adding twice as much for the grandeur of the moment, by doubling what he chose to think the amount of Mr. Moreland's preferment, trebling his private fortune, bestowing a rich aunt, and sinking half the children, he was able to represent the whole family to the general in a most respectable light. For Catherine, however, the peculiar object of the general's curiosity and his own speculations, he had yet something more in reserve, and the 10 or 15,000 pounds which her father could give her would be a pretty addition to Mr. Allen's estate. Her intimacy there had made him seriously determined on her being handsomely legacied hereafter, and I don't know what that means, and I'm not going to think too hard. To speak of her, therefore, as the almost acknowledged future heiress of Fullerton naturally followed. Upon such intelligence the general had proceeded, for it had occurred to him to doubt its authority. Thorpe's interest in the family, by his sister's approaching connection with one of its members, and his own views on another, circumstances of which he boasted with almost equal openness, seemed sufficient vouchers for his truth, and to these were added the absolute facts of the Allens being wealthy and childless, of Miss Moreland's being under their care, and, as soon as his acquaintance allowed him to judge, of their treating her with parental kindness. His resolution was soon formed. Already he had discerned a liking towards Miss Moreland in the countenance of his son, and thankful for Mr. Thorpe's communication, he almost instantly determined to spare no pains in weakening his boasted interest and ruining his dearest hopes. Catherine herself could not be more important at the time of all this than his own children. Henry and Eleanor, perceiving nothing in her situation likely to engage their father's particular respect, had seen with astonishment the suddenness, continuance, and extent of his affection, and though latterly, from some hints which had accompanied an almost positive command to his son of doing everything in his power to attach her, Henry was convinced of his father's believing it to be an advantageous connection. It was not till the late explanation at Northanger that they had the smallest idea of the false calculations which had hurried him on. That they were false, the general had learned from the very person who had suggested them, from Thorpe himself, whom he had chanced to meet again in town, and who, under the influence of exactly opposite feelings, irritated by Catherine's refusal, and yet more by the failure of a very recent endeavour to accomplish a reconciliation between Moreland and Isabella, convinced that they were separated forever, and spurning a friendship which could be no longer serviceable, hastened to contradict all that he had said before to the advantage of the Morelands, confessed himself to have been totally mistaken in his opinion of their circumstances and character, misled by the rodomontade. Rodomontade? There's like a ballet term that's called like Ronjamon or something. Has anyone ever seen that word before? I haven't. I personally have not. Where was it? What is that? Ronjamon? I don't even know. Misled by the rodomontade, yes, of his friend, to believe his father a man of substance and credit, whereas the transactions of the 2 or 3 last weeks proved him to be neither, for after coming eagerly forward on the first overture of marriage between the families, with the most liberal proposals, he had, on being brought to the point by the shrewdness of the relator, been constrained to acknowledge himself incapable of giving the young people even a decent support. They were, in fact, a necessitous family, numerous too, almost beyond example, by no means respected in their own neighborhood, as he had lately had particular opportunities of discovering, aiming at a style of life which their fortune could not warrant, seeking to better themselves by wealthy connections, a forward, bragging, scheming race. I don't like that. Okay, so I figured out what half the children means, is that when John was first telling Papa Tilney about Catherine's family, he was like, I'm just going to pretend that half of her siblings don't exist to make it seem like she's going to get more money. Because the amount of her siblings mean that like the money will be split between all of them. Where was I? Okay. The terrified general pronounced the name of Allen with an inquiring look, and here too Thorpe had learnt his error. The Allens, he believed, had lived near them too long, and he knew the young man on whom the Fullerton estate must devolve. The general needed no more. Engaged with almost everybody in the world but himself, he set out the next day for the Abbey, where his performances had been seen. I leave it to my reader's sagacity to determine how much of all this it was possible for Henry to communicate at this time to Catherine, how much of it he could learn from his father, in what points his own conjectures might assist him, and what portion must yet remain to be told in a letter from James. I have united for their ease what they must divide from mine. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. You know what? Yeah. Like, honestly, yeah. I wouldn't put it past him. He was like, honey, you're not going to come into a huge sum of money? That's so interesting. I just have to go get something in the kitchen. Will you just stay here for a second? I'll just be right back. Here we go. Where was I? Henry, in having such things to relate of his father, was almost as pitiable in their first avowal to himself, as in their first avowal to himself. He blushed for the narrow-minded counsel which he was obliged to expose. The conversation between them at Northanger had been of the most unfriendly kind. Henry's indignation on hearing how Catherine had been treated, on comprehending his father's views, and being ordered to acquiesce in them, had been open and bold. Sorry. Gotta go. The general, accustomed on every ordinary occasion, I'm really upset. Don't look at me. Just gonna finish the reading like this. The general, accustomed on every ordinary occasion to give the law on his family, prepared for no reluctance but of feeling, no opposing desire that should dare to clothe itself in words, could ill brook the opposition of his son, steady as the sanction of reason and the dictate of conscience could make it. Excuse me. But in such a cause, his anger, though it must be shock, could not intimidate Henry, who was sustained in his purpose by a conviction of its justice. He felt himself bound as much in honour as in affection to Miss Moreland, and believing that heart to be his own, which he had been directed to gain, no unworthy retraction of a tacit consent, no reversing decree of unjustifiable anger, could shake his fidelity or influence the resolutions it prompted. He steadily refused to accompany his father into Hertfordshire, an engagement formed almost at the moment to promote the dismissal of Catherine, and as steadily declared his intention of offering her his hand. The general was furious in his anger, and they parted in dreadful disagreement. Henry, in agitation of mind which many solitary hours were required to compose, had returned almost instantly to Woodston, and on the afternoon of the following day had begun his journey to Fullerton. Henry seems like an honourable Jew. Northanger Abbey, Volume 2, Chapter 16. Mr. and Mrs. Moreland's surprise. Is that really bad, that noise? No one said anything about it, so there we go. Thank you. Thanks, Raymond. Raymond's my landlord. Okay. Mr. and Mrs. Moreland's surprise on being applied to by Mr. Tilney for their consent to his marrying their daughter was, for a few minutes, considerable, it having never entered their heads to suspect an attachment on either side. Really? But as nothing, after all, could be more natural than Catherine's being beloved. Oh! My God! They soon learned to consider it with only the happy agitation of gratified pride, and, as far as they alone were concerned, had not a single objection to start. His pleasing manners and good sense were self-evident recommendations, and having never heard evil of him, it was not their way to suppose any evil could be told. Goodwill supplying the place of experience, his character needed no attestation. Catherine would make a sad, heedless young housekeeper, to be sure, was her mother's foreboding remark. But quick was the consolation of there being nothing like practice. There was but one obstacle, in short, to be mentioned, but till that one was removed, it must be impossible for them to sanction the engagement. Their tempers were mild, but their principles were steady, and while his parents so expressly forbade the connection, they could not allow themselves to encourage it. There we go. That the general should come forward to solicit the alliance, or that he should even very heartily approve it, they were not refined enough to make any parading stipulation, but the decent appearance of consent must be yielded, and that once obtained, and their own hearts made them trust that it could not be very long denied, their willing approbation was instantly to follow. I think my biggest takeaway from all these readings is that I learned what the word approbation means. I'm not going to relate it here. I know it up here, but I couldn't say it, you know? I guess approval, mostly. There we go. I love it. Sorry, I was like waiting to see if someone corrected me in the chat. His consent was all that his consent was all that they wished for. They were no more inclined than entitled to demand his money. Of a very considerable portion his son was, by marriage settlements, eventually secure. His present income was an income of independence and comfort, and under every pecuniary view, it was a match beyond the claims of their daughter. The young people could not be surprised at a decision like this. They felt and they deplored, but they could not resent it, and they parted, endeavoring to hope that a change in the general, as each believed almost impossible, might speedily take place to unite them again in the fullness of privileged affection. Henry returned to what was now his only home to watch over his young plantations and extend his improvements for her sake, to whose share in them he looked anxiously forward. And Catherine remained at Fullerton to cry, "Oh no! That's so sweet!" Oh, I was not anticipating the end of that sentence. Oh. Whether the I really did not think that sentence was going to end. Whether the torments of absence were softened by clandestine correspondence, let us not inquire. Bye, babe. I'm just going to cry. Mr. and Mrs. Moreland never did. They had been too kind to exact any promise, and whenever Catherine received a letter, as, at that time, happened pretty often, they always looked another way. The anxiety which in this state of their attachment must be the portion of Henry and Catherine, and of all who loved either, as to its final event, can hardly extend, I fear, to the bosom of my readers, who will see in the telltale compression of the pages before them that we are all hastening together to perfect felicity. I love that. She's like, there's one page left, like, we know what's going to happen, but keep reading anyways, I guess. The means by which their early marriage was effected can only be the only doubt. What probable circumstance could work upon a temper like the General's? The circumstance which chiefly availed was the marriage of his daughter with a man of fortune and consequence, which took place in the course of the summer. Isabella got married? Wait, Eleanor? An accession of dignity that threw him into a fit of good humor, from which he did not recover till after Eleanor had obtained his forgiveness of Henry, and his permission for him to be a fool if he liked it. Who did she get married to? She was a baby. The marriage of Eleanor Tilney, her removal from all the evils of such a home as Northanger had been made by Henry's banishment, to the home of her choice and the man of her choice, okay, that's good, is an event which I expect to give general satisfaction among all her acquaintance. My own joy on the occasion is very sincere. I know no one who is more entitled by unpretending merit, or better prepared by habitual suffering, to receive and enjoy felicity. Her partiality for this gentleman was not of recent origin. He had been long withheld only by inferiority of situation from addressing her. His unexpected ascension to title and fortune had removed all his difficulties, and never had the General loved his daughter so well in all her hours of companionship, utility, and patient endurance as when he first hailed her, "Your ladyship." Her husband was really deserving of her. Independent of his peerage, his wealth, and his attachment, being to a precision the most charming young man in the world. Any further definition of his merits must be unnecessary. The most charming young man in the world is instantly before the imagination of us all. I'm so upset. The cute meter is off the charts. Concerning the one in question, therefore, I have only to add, aware that all the rules of composition forbid the introduction of a character not connected with my fable, that this was the very gentleman whose negligent servant left behind him that collection of washing bills, resulting from a long visit at Northanger, by which my heroine was involved in one of her most alarming adventures. What a way to tie it together. The influence of the Viscount and Viscountess in their brother's behalf was assisted by that right understanding of Mr. Moreland's circumstances, which, as soon as the General would allow himself to be informed, they were qualified to give. It taught him that he had been scarcely more misled by Thorpe's first boast of the family wealth than by his subsequent malicious overthrow of it, that in no sense of the word were they necessitous or poor, and that Catherine would have £3,000, This was so material an amendment of his late expectations that it greatly contributed to smooth the descent of his pride, and by no means without its effect was the private intelligence, which he was at some pains to procure, that the Fullerton estate, being entirely at the disposal of its present proprietor, was consequently open to every greedy speculation. On the strength of this, the general, soon after Eleanor's marriage, permitted his son to return to Northanger, and thence made him the bearer of his consent, very courteously worded in a page full of empty professions to Mr. Moreland. The event which authorized soon followed. Henry and Catherine were married, the bells rang, and everybody smiled. And as this took place within a 12-month from the first day of their meeting, it will not appear, after all the dreadful delays occasioned by the general's cruelty, that they were essentially hurt by it. To begin perfect happiness at the respective ages of 26 and 18. Who did not think of that? It was 24. It doesn't really make it better. I'm a little upset. Is to do pretty well, and professing myself moreover convinced that the general's unjust interference, so far from being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it by improving their knowledge of each other, and adding strength to their attachment, I leave it to be settled by whomsoever it may concern, whether the tendency of this work be altogether to recommend parental tyranny, or reward filial disobedience. Finis. That's the end, folks. That's all, folks. There's more in this book. There's like Lady Susan, but we're not reading that. Here we go. Ponk. Ponk and huzzah. I think Ponk, that's what I'm gonna put at the end of all of my movies. While some people put like Finn or the end, I'm gonna put Ponk with an exclamation mark. It's good. We do a theater near you. Oh my I'm gonna do it. Everyone's gonna be like, why? What does that mean? There's gonna be like conspiracy theories. People are gonna write essays about it, but it's just gonna be me closing a book and saying Ponk isn't even a word. It's not even close to a word. Okay. I'm really glad. I'm really glad I got one last really good laugh out of this. That makes my heart really happy. A beautiful cursive scroll. They'll be confused for a minute, but pretty soon I'll have entered a new word into the English lexicon. Shakespeare who? Shakespeare coming up with words like puppy and other words, eyeball. I came up with Ponk. Shakespeare, get on my level. Well, that ends our daily reading journey. It has been a really, really wonderful time. I have loved talking with all of you in the chats, talking with all of you during your screenings, which we'll have another one soon. And just being able to like do something fun and regular every day that brought a little light and hope and happiness into my soul, except for Wuthering Heights. She was dark AF. So, with all that being said, I will be in your inboxes pretty soon to talk about maybe doing a weekly reading and when we're going to watch the Northanger Abbey adaptation. And I have a funny story to tell you about the Northanger Abbey adaptation, sort of. Wuthering Heights was pretty sad. Okay, well, with that, it is time to log off for the final time. Once again, this has been such a wonderful journey. Oh my god. This has been such a wonderful journey. I will miss it greatly. It buzzed. So with that, I end our stream, and I wish you all the best, and hopefully I'll see you next week for a reading. But until then, Have a wonderful time. Eat wonderful food. Try and stay happy. Try and stay active. I know that it's hard to do right now, but make the choices that make you happy right now. Even if that means playing dress-up games and drinking wine. If that's what makes you happy in the moment, you do it. So, with those final words of wisdom, goodbye and thank you. Thank you and good night.